My name is Emma Hayes, and on a Tuesday afternoon at exactly 2:17 p.m., a single text ended 8 years of my life. We need to talk. I don't think this is working anymore. 8 years of love reduced to 12 words. I had moved cities for him, turned down an MBA scholarship for him, used up all my savings to buy a shared apartment. But the deed had only one name on it: Chase Reynolds. No conversation, no warning, just 12 words, enough to tear down everything I had sacrificed for him: my youth, my career, and the apartment I had nearly paid off but that legally belonged to him. I used to believe that if you loved enough, you'd never be the one left behind. But have you ever been replaced by someone the world says is more worthy than you? What would you do if the person who once held your hand now smiles holding someone else's, right in the ruins of the dream you helped build? If you've ever felt that, leave a comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for the next part, because this story isn't over. It's just beginning. I still remember exactly how it felt that day when Liv, my younger sister, knocked on the door of my tiny apartment, like she was stepping into a collapsed world. She walked in silently and pulled me into a hug. Her coat still carried the scent of lavender from the little shop near Mom's house, and with that alone, I broke down in tears. We sat on the living room floor beside 2 mugs of hot cocoa she had made. I didn't have the energy to clean up anymore. Papers from work, boxes Chase had left behind, and the wedding brochures I hadn't gotten around to canceling. All scattered, quiet like my mind. Liv didn't scold me. She looked at me for a long moment and said gently, "You've shrunk so small I barely recognize you. Small for someone who never really saw you." I let out a weak laugh. Maybe he did see me, but only the version he could use. She shook her head. "No. He saw what he could take from you, not who you really were." We sat in silence for a while. I glanced around the apartment, the place I had paid the entire down payment for, with 6 years' worth of savings. But the deed bore only Chase's name, because at the time he had said, "We're not married yet. Putting your name might make taxes more complicated." I had believed him, believed every excuse he made to push my dreams further down the line. I had once been offered a project manager position at a green architecture firm in Portland, one of the biggest breaks of my career, but Chase had just landed a spot at Atlas Group in Boston. He said, "If you love me, you won't leave me during this transition." So I left, said goodbye to Portland and to myself. Liv pulled out a stack of papers from her backpack, looked at me, and said, "Do you remember this design?" I froze. It was the draft I had once drawn for my own startup idea. A blueprint for a community space that combined an outdoor library, a vocational center, and an urban garden for kids in underserved neighborhoods. "You sent this to me last year. You were so excited," Liv said softly. "But now you never talk about it anymore." I nodded, leaned forward, and opened my laptop. As I searched through the old folder, the concept photos I'd taken of the paper models began to appear. The colors were a little faded, snapped on an old phone, but the lines were still clear. I zoomed in on one, taken from an upper diagonal angle, where I had added a tiny light to simulate afternoon sunlight. "You said architecture should listen to people, not just flaunt its shape," Liv recalled, then turned to me. "About now." I didn't answer right away, but as I stared at the screen, something stirred inside me. It had been a long time since I saw that look in my own eyes, the look of someone who believed in herself. I opened LinkedIn. My profile had been untouched for nearly a year, still titled Community Design Architect on Creative Sabbatical. I clicked edit but hadn't typed a word when a new notification popped up. A message from someone named Tucker Ellison, just a few lines. "Saw your sketch reposted through an old article. Bold and compassionate concept. Would you be open to a conversation?" I read it 3 times. My eyes froze on the sentence and my heart pounded. "What's wrong?" Liv asked. I turned to the screen. Clicked his name. CEO of Ellison Urban Development, a New York-based developer focusing on sustainable and community-centered projects. I didn't know who had shared that article. Didn't know how Tucker had found it. But one thing was clear: the image I once thought was a relic of a broken dream was now opening a door. Liv placed her hand on my shoulder. If this is an opportunity, she said, you're not allowed to let anyone dim it again. I stayed silent, eyes fixed on the reply box, fingers suspended above the keyboard. Yes, I'd be open to a conversation, and I hit send. I took an early train to New York on a cold gray morning. It was early March, still biting in the air. The tall buildings stood quiet behind a veil of smoke like rain. I sat by the window, gripping a cloth bag filled with old documents, sketches, and color prints I had carefully assembled years ago. Every time I looked down at those drawings, I saw the version of me from years before, eager, untouched by disillusionment. The office of Ellison Urban Development was on the 21st floor of a glass tower in Midtown. I arrived 10 minutes early and was led by the receptionist to a quiet waiting room overlooking a small park. 2 cups of coffee were already set on the table, along with a handwritten note. Emma Hayes, welcome. I was still wondering when the door opened. The man who walked in didn't look like the CEO I had imagined. No 3-piece suit, no designer tie. He wore a pale gray shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. A face slightly weathered with silver at his temples, but his eyes, sharp yet warm, made me pause. I'm Tucker Ellison, he said, offering his hand. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you for reaching out, I said, shaking his hand, my palm a little cold. Tucker got straight to the point. He spread out the prints I had emailed him, treating them with the care of precious documents. You know, he began, when I saw this sketch, the first thing I thought was, this isn't just a design, this is a story. I didn't know how to respond. We're about to redevelop an old factory lot in Brooklyn, he continued. The goal is to transform it into a vibrant community space, something that integrates arts, education, basic healthcare, and shared gathering zones, but every design I've received so far lacks humanity. They're technically perfect, but soulless. He pointed to my design. This green bridge connecting functions. The reading garden facing morning light, the natural ventilation system. None of this was in the brief. But you thought of it. Why? I took a deep breath. Because I believe space can heal, especially when it's created for people who no longer get to choose where they live. He nodded. I need minds like yours. I couldn't help but ask. Why me? There are so many more accomplished architects out there. Tucker smiled slightly. Most of them designed to be celebrated. You, it seems, designed to listen. Before I could say anything, he added, I'd like to bring you on as a consultant for the initial phase, 6 months, full-time or part-time, whatever works best for you. We'll cover housing if you decide to relocate to New York. I sat quietly for a few seconds. In my mind, I saw Chase standing next to Brielle in an online article, captioned proudly, New VP of Atlas Group and Carter Heiress, the power couple of real estate development. Atlas Group, the Brooklyn factory lot. That name wasn't unfamiliar. I remembered Chase mentioning this exact project over dinner once, saying they were preparing to take control of the East Side redevelopment. I looked up and tried to keep my voice steady. May I ask, did this project used to belong to Atlas Group? Tucker raised an eyebrow slightly. That's right. But they lost the rights due to delays and failure to meet community requirements. Why do you ask? I shook my head and gave a faint smile. I just have a small connection to them. He didn't press further. He simply said, You don't need to answer right away, but if you agree, we'd like to begin within the next 3 weeks. I looked out the window. The rain had stopped. A weak sunlight passed through the glass, casting a thin thread of light across the table. I had once chosen Chase over the biggest opportunity of my life, had once folded that very design and tucked it deep into a drawer, because someone told me it was just a hobby, had stepped back, believing love was more important than personal ambition. I accept. Tucker smiled. Then welcome to Ellison. And for some reason when I shook his hand, my palm wasn't cold anymore. 1 month after accepting Tucker's offer, I officially started my role at Ellison Urban Development. The Brooklyn Factory Restoration Project had entered its stakeholder coordination phase. Investors, local government reps, and previous bidding developers. I knew someone from Atlas Group would be there, but I hadn't expected Chase Reynolds to show up himself. The meeting was held in a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River. I arrived early, laid out documents and drawings across the table. My breath had steadied, but my chest still trembled like a tightened string. Then the door opened. The sound of leather shoes echoed faintly across the tiles. I didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. Emma. That voice chilled me more than the air conditioner ever could. I looked up. Chase stood there. Deep blue shirt, hugging the same familiar build, hair neatly styled, eyes flashing half surprise, half mockery. "So this is what you're doing now?" he said, smirking as his gaze slid over my designs. I simply smiled softly, tilting my head. "How've you been?" "Good, very good," Chase nodded, taking the seat across from me. "I didn't know Allison was interested in your old hobby." Bitter callback to the words he once used when I shared my original project idea. The one he had dismissed as something you do for fun when you're bored. Tucker walked in right after, his eyes sweeping quickly over the two of us like he sensed something but said nothing. He spent most of the meeting leading discussion, laying out the design roadmap and roles of each team. Chase didn't speak much, but his gaze kept landing on me, unfiltered, unapologetic. 3 days later, I received a proposal file submitted by Atlas Group for another round of bidding, this time for the land behind the main factory, intended to be a supplemental community space. I opened the file. On the very first page, my heart seized. The overall layout mirrored a sketch I had drawn nearly a year ago, 90% identical. The rooftop garden placement, the corridor layout connecting buildings, the night lighting system using solar panels, even the aloe plants lined up along the second floor railing, everything was almost exact. And I had never made that design public. Except once. I had emailed it to Chase on a weekend evening when he said he needed a reference to help the junior team with concept planning. I still remembered the subject line, "Personal concept, not for sharing." I opened that old email again, then pulled up the metadata on the file Atlas had sent. The original creator was an internal Atlas account, but the edit history, accessed through Ellison's secure system, showed it started from my file. Same format, same scale, same tiny watermark I always placed in the lower left corner. I sat frozen. My back felt nailed to the chair, not because I was surprised, but because an old wound, one that had never fully healed, had been ripped open again. I told no one at Ellison, didn't call Tucker, didn't tell Liv. That night, I got home late. Light rain fell across my shoulders. I brewed tea, turned on a dim amber light, and pulled out all my old sketches. I saw myself there. In every line, every corridor I imagined for kids to play safely, every stairwell designed so the elderly could rest. Tiny details I added not to show off, but to listen, just like Tucker once said. Chase hadn't stolen a drawing. He had trespassed into the last memory I had kept sacred for myself. I placed my hand on the folder and closed my eyes. No, anger wouldn't serve me. Emotion couldn't lead this fight. I needed clarity, strategy, a truth so solid it would leave no room for doubt. Because this wasn't just about my name. It was about everything they erased. On a Monday morning, I got a message from Mia, a college friend now working at a media agency in Manhattan. "Emma, have you seen the news this morning? Atlas just unveiled their community arts factory design on CNBC." I clicked the link she sent. The screen lit up with Chase's confident face, standing beside a 3D model of the project, in a conference room. He wore a light gray suit, hair swept back, that same confident grin like he'd conceptualized the whole thing himself. Behind him was a sign, Atlas Group, revitalizing Brooklyn through innovation. I didn't need more than 3 minutes. The renderings flashing across the LED screen behind Chase were my drawings. Slightly tweaked, but unmistakable. Curved hallways, clusters of greenery, a small courtyard with a wall designed for local residents to paint graffiti freely. Chase called it a pioneering effort in social integration, a human-centered breakthrough in urban development. His tone was passionate, his eyes sparkled. That night, I called Professor Miranda Black, my thesis advisor at Cornell and current editor-in-chief of the Civic Forum, a prestigious architecture journal. "I have a story," I told her. But it's not just personal, it's about how some corporations are stealing creative work and calling it innovation. Send me the draft and the proof, she said firmly. If it's what you say, we'll put it on the front page. I wrote the article in one night. It wasn't written in bitterness or blame. It was a precise, well-documented comparison, laying out every element from my original sketch and how it mirrored the version Atlas had announced. I cited metadata showing the timestamps of file creation and revisions, attached the original email I had sent Chase, and included a personal note. Gentle, but not weak. When a woman chooses not to stay silent, it's not because she wants attention, but because she knows the value of her voice. 3 days later, the article was published. Within the first 24 hours, it was shared over 8,000 times on LinkedIn and Twitter. Young architects, urban planners, professors, design students, everyone started asking, why does Atlas's design match so precisely? Why was there no mention of the original inspiration, if they truly shared the same vision? The architecture community began analyzing it themselves. People posted side-by-side comparisons. Some called it sophisticated plagiarism. Others labeled it intellectual theft wrapped in corporate polish. I didn't stop there. I launched a short podcast series titled Blueprints and Boundaries. In the first episode, I told the story behind a forgotten design and how a sketch buried in a drawer became a national headline because someone dared to speak up. I never said Chase's name, but everyone knew. In episode 2, I interviewed a female architect who had her community center idea in New Jersey stolen by her former firm. In episode 3, I invited an intellectual property attorney to break down how major corporations often use the silence of lower-level employees as a shield to protect unethical gains. The podcast hit the top 5 on Apple Podcasts in the design and justice category within just 10 days. And right around that time, Chase posted on LinkedIn. His profile photo was a polished headshot, a 3D project model in the background. The post sounded professional on the surface, but anyone reading it knew exactly what it meant. Success is often mistaken for theft, especially when it comes from those who didn't have the courage to see it through. I choose to build, not to complain. My phone rang. It was Tucker. I just read his post, he said, voice low and steady. Are you okay? I am now, I replied softly. Then I smiled, quietly, as if whispering to myself, let it burn. When the Civic Forum released its special edition the following month, featuring an editorial emphasizing the importance of ethics in design and the protection of intellectual property, the name Atlas Group appeared no fewer than 5 times, each instance accompanied by sharp questions about transparency and public trust. Less than a week later, I received an internal email from Tucker. The City Council has decided to remove Atlas Group from the list of preferred partners. We'll be taking over the entire rear parcel. The news spread almost as fast as the scandal itself. Atlas's stock dropped for 3 consecutive days. The media picked up the story from multiple angles, from the soft power of social media to the legal gray areas in protecting creative ideas. But what truly stunned me was a line in CNBC's report. Chase Reynolds, Vice President of Strategic Development at Atlas Group, was officially terminated this morning. No press conference, no explanation, just a short statement, and his name vanished from the company's website as if he'd never existed. That same afternoon, I received an invitation from Columbia University. The Department of Urban Architecture wanted me to serve as a guest lecturer for the course Designing for Community Recovery After Crisis. The email came from Professor Black, she wrote. Not everyone has lived through something sharp enough to teach students about architecture with empathy, but you do. I sat in front of the screen for a long time after clicking accept. It didn't feel like recognition. It felt like a lost part of me was finally returning. A week later, Ivy Tucker's daughter walked into my office with a small box wrapped in paper, covered in colorful drawings. I made this in art class, she chirped. It's for your birthday. I sat down and opened the box. Inside was a paper model of a domed house, with 2 folded paper wings attached to its sides. Is it a flying house? I asked, laughing. Ivy nodded, completely serious. Because you make houses that help people fly away from bad stuff? I didn't know who had taught her to use the word bad stuff so precisely, but something inside me melted. I hugged her tightly. That evening, Tucker invited me over for dinner, not to talk about work. There were no designs on the table, no meetings to review. Just a homemade lasagna, a bottle of red wine, and the warm air of his rustic kitchen. I used to think, Tucker said as we sat on the steps watching Ivy play with the neighbor's chubby cat, that connection between two adults after heartbreak would always come with cracks. I tilted my head toward him. And now? He didn't answer immediately. He just turned to me, his gaze gentle like a breath. Now I think if two people are patient enough not to hide the cracks, but to patch them with honesty, then things don't have to be perfect to last. I didn't know if that was a confession, but I felt something deeper than a promise. The next morning I received a strange envelope in the building's mailbox. No return address. Cream-colored, no stamp, no label. Inside were 4 photographs. I recognized them almost instantly. Photos of me and Chase, back when we were in love. At the old apartment. One of me in a towel, smiling shyly at the camera. Another of me asleep at the drafting table, draped in Chase's shirt. The photos weren't explicit, but they were intimate and private. Moments that should never exist anywhere but memory. Alongside the photos was a small slip of paper. A message typed in default computer font. Are you sure you want to keep showing up in the media? Learn to be quiet. I set the paper down and sat there for a long time. They still thought I could be wounded the old way. I knew without a doubt there was only one person who had ever had access to those pictures. And only one person, low enough to think sending them now could make me retreat. Chase Reynolds. No more doubt. Whether he sent them himself or through someone else, the trace was too clear. Those images only ever existed on one USB drive. The same one I had returned to him after I moved out. I remember because I had handwritten the label, personal files. Back then, I still believed something like trust could survive a breakup. I didn't call, didn't text. Instead, I issued a formal legal notice through a privacy rights attorney I had met at an Ellison seminar. The content was simple and clear. Any further action involving threats, dissemination, or use of my personal images would be prosecuted under applicable state and federal law. A week later, Chase posted on social media. This time, it wasn't to show off a project model or make subtle jabs. The post appeared with an all-caps headline. A public apology. It read, I would like to publicly apologize to Emma Hayes for my recent reckless actions. Sending personal photographs to her was an emotional, inappropriate act, and I take full responsibility. I had no intention to distribute or damage her image. I let my emotions get the better of me and acted wrongly. I am stepping away from all professional platforms for the foreseeable future to reflect and make amends. A part of me felt relieved, not because of the apology, but because that public statement would put an end to the dirty games in the dark. I was no longer in Chase's game. I was living a different life, one where his name no longer held any weight. That evening, Tucker came over after taking Ivy to a friend's birthday party. He brought a box of fruit tarts that Ivy had insisted Miss Emma has to eat first. I made tea. He didn't ask anything right away. Only after I briefly explained the apology post, my reaction, and the action I had taken, did Tucker set down his teacup. You know, he said, eyes steady, I can love someone who's been hurt, but I've never once seen you as a victim. Because everything you've done, he continued, isn't about escaping the wound. It's about building something deeper than the pain. That sentence stayed with me the entire night. 3 days later, I sat inside a small recording room on the first floor of the Ellison studio, a space that used to be a material storage room, now transformed into a creative zone for ideas without borders. I turned on the mic, tested the sound, then looked at the note I had taped next to the recording console. Healing doesn't only come from the walls, it comes from the one who builds them. The first episode of a new podcast, Blueprints for the Soul, a project I never thought I'd have the courage to start. I didn't open with architecture theory. I told stories about the first time I drew a curved line on a community housing model. And no one laughed. The quiet ache of being forgotten in a home I helped pay for, and how a small design, once dismissed as a hobby, ended up costing a finance giant its land development rights. And then I said, rebuilding isn't just for structures, it's for people too. I shared how I had once shrunk myself to fit inside someone else's life. Then, one day, realized I could expand. Without asking for permission. I didn't know who would listen to that first episode, but saying it out loud was enough. Not for revenge, but for cleansing. I wanted to create a space where those who'd been hurt could listen to each other in something other than silence. And I knew somewhere out there, someone needed that as badly as I once did. One thing no one could ever threaten or take back again was my voice. I named the new space Emma Hayes Studio for Human-Centered Design. A long name may be too formal for some, but true to what I wanted. A place that designs not just for buildings, but for the people inside them. The studio sits on the second floor of an old warehouse in South Williamsburg. I restored every brick, kept the raw concrete walls, and let natural light pour in through the skylight. It didn't need to be flashy, just real. Quiet enough to listen, spacious enough to nurture something new. The first project I took on after going independent wasn't an office building or a shopping center. It was an old factory in Yonkers, New York, abandoned for nearly 20 years. Soon to become an art and learning center for children growing up in areas impacted by community violence. I first visited the site on a gloomy morning. Grass had overgrown the doorway, the walls were coated in moss, and a broken fluorescent light fixture still dangled from the ceiling. But what I saw were frames waiting to be hung, children's songs yet to echo, and tiny feet ready to run through bursts of color. I told the project sponsor, a local nonprofit, I want to build a space where every child can see themselves, no matter their skin color, their background, or the fragments of the world they carry with them. I spent that spring sketching models with my team, an art room with high ceilings and natural lighting, a circular library with a loft and beanbag chairs made from recycled denim, a small performance space with wooden floors repurposed from old factory trees. Every detail carried the same question. What would make a child want to come back tomorrow? One afternoon in mid-app room, while I was reviewing electrical and lighting plans with the lead engineer, my phone rang. Unknown number, California area code. This is Laura Simmons from TEDx Santa Monica, a woman said on the other end. We've been following your article and podcast for a while now, and we believe your story isn't just about architecture, it's a blueprint for healing. I'm deeply honored, I whispered, still holding a red pen over the drawings. We'd like you to speak about the process of rebuilding not just physical spaces but inner lives. This year's theme is structures that heal. I accept. After the call, I sat down on the wooden chair in my studio. Outside, Ivy was circling on her little bike in front of the door, while Tucker was reattaching the studio's nameplate that had been knocked loose in last week's windstorm. I signaled for him to stop drilling and said, "Did you know I just accepted an invitation to speak at TEDx?" Tucker raised an eyebrow, smiling as bright as the sun. "Oh, really? So, should we celebrate?" "Yes. But there's one more thing," I said, resting my hand lightly on the doorframe, my heart as still as an afternoon lake. I didn't finish the sentence. But he walked over, stood beside me, and I knew I didn't need to. That evening, while Ivy curled in my lap coloring the last panel of her flying house picture, she whispered, "I think you and Daddy should get married, then build the wedding cake together." Tucker, carrying a plate of sliced apples, froze in place. I looked at him, and we both burst out laughing. Ivy kept coloring, unaware of the quiet earthquake she'd just triggered. "I don't have a ring in my pocket," Tucker said later as I walked him to the porch. "You don't need one," I replied, resting my hand on his chest. "Just don't go anywhere." He held my hand. "Then, let's promise each other today, on this porch, with Ivy as our witness." I nodded. Amid the breeze and soft yellow glow from the living room, I realized I was standing in a different kind of wedding. No white dress, no elaborate vows, just one truth. Someone had seen me break, and still chose to stay. On a June morning, sunlight filtered through the willow branches outside the Wingspace Community Center, a name Ivy came up with for the first project that now bore my own name. 1 year ago, this place was just a cold slab of concrete, an abandoned textile factory. Today, I stood before a group of senior architecture students ready to lead their tour. Miss Emma, one student called excitedly. I heard the south wall glows like the aurora borealis at night, is that true? Oh, I laughed. Not quite that magical. But if you stand at the right angle at just the right hour, you might catch a light that makes you want to stay a little longer. The group chuckled, but as always when I stood at this entrance, my eyes drifted to the edge of the fence near the road. I paused. Chase Reynolds. He stood still beyond the fence. No suit or tie, only rolled-up sleeves and worn khakis. The polished smile was gone, replaced by a quieter, more tired face. We looked at each other through the bougainvillea fence. Far enough apart to no longer be a conversation, only an acknowledgement. He lifted a hand, a small wave. There was no hope in his eyes, only the quiet presence of a man who once walked out of my life and now stood outside a world he could no longer enter. It was time to release something that had once weighed heavier than memory. Ivy's voice rang behind me. She ran up, grabbed my hand and tugged. Let's go show them your magic wall. I laughed, crouching to tie her shoelaces. My magic wall didn't get dusted this morning. That's okay. Dust is part of the magic too, Ivy chirped, making the students behind us laugh out loud. I stood up. The group followed us inside. Down the main hallway were murals painted by local children during the center's first 6 months. The lines were messy but vibrant. A house shaped like a heart, a purple bridge stretching from the building to the moon, a 3-legged dog grinning in a wildflower patch. No sense of proportion, no design axes, but it was real and free. In a quiet corner of the library, I saw 2 little girls reading together, heads resting on each other. On the shelf above them was the book I once gave Ivy, The Most Magnificent Thing. I turned to my students. Have any of you ever believed a drawing could change how a child sees the world? One young woman raised her hand, eyes shining. Yes, I was that child once. I looked out toward the back courtyard where Ivy's magic wall stood, a ceramic reflective surface that shimmered differently depending on the weather. On sunny days it gleamed like stained glass. On cloudy ones it softened like pressed linen. And when it rained, like in my memories, it looked as if it was breathing. I knew Chase was still behind the fence. Maybe he'd stay a few minutes longer, maybe more. But I didn't turn back. Because behind me were what used to be, ahead of me was what was becoming. And I kept walking, light as if there was nothing left to prove, and nothing left to run from. Sometimes, retribution doesn't come from making someone pay. It comes from living beautifully enough that they'll always carry the weight of losing you. What do you think of my story? Of someone who was once dismissed, robbed of her dreams and her voice, and still chose not to scream, not to strike back, but to quietly rebuild a life right where it had fallen apart? Have you ever stood at a similar crossroads between acting out in anger and standing up in a way that no longer requires it? I believe each of us has our own magic wall as long as we're brave enough to begin building it brick by brick. If this story brought back something you once lost, hurt over, or gave up on, share it with me in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. Because here, every voice matters. And if you believe there are deeper journeys waiting to unfold, don't forget to follow this channel. There are still many stories being written about family, trust, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of those who choose never to stay silent again. See you in the next chapter.